Blake was quite a charming character, and Bond undoubtedly was. I mean, the Bond was an adventurer and used all sorts of fancy gadgets and guns and all the rest of it, and that wasn't really Blake's modus operandi. Funnily enough, they made a film about Blake in Moscow called this, not The Secret Lives of Agent Blake, which is what my book's called, but the Two Lives of George Blake. And it was a sort of drama documentary, and the commentary at the beginning was trying to give the film, you know, character and romance, and it likened Blake to Bond, but I don't think the association is really quite equivalent. I mean, Blake is more similar to a sort of Le Carre type character, I think, than to an Ian Fleming character. Fleming set up this intelligence unit in World War II, and when Blake got to Hamburg in 1946, he inherited something called the Forward Intelligence Unit, which was an offshoot of Fleming's group, and the Forward Intelligence Unit, which Blake took over and turned it more into a Cold War espionage sort of operation rather than a World War II operation, was actually headed by a chap called Charles Wheeler, famous BBC foreign correspondent. So that was interesting. Charles Wheeler knew George Blake, and Charles Wheeler had lots of interesting things to say about George Blake. He thought he was a very odd sort of character. So it's kind of Fleming, Wheeler, Blake. There is a link, but it's not a direct link. But these characters, all these people in the espionage world, you know, do seem to have links to each other, and do, you know, you can draw a sort of circle and put things, you know, put lines in, and you can meet the 3 or 4 of them up. If you're making a film or something, you'd probably do it this way. But Blake and Philby almost certainly passed each other in the corridors in Broadway, which is where SIS or MI6's headquarters were in 1944. Because Blake was just joining as a young recruit, aged 21. Philby was just taking over a new section called Section 9, which is a counterintelligence against the Soviet Union section. But they're probably on different floors, but you sort of, it's almost, you could write a short story about it. It's almost as if they may have met in the lift, not really knew who they were and all the rest of it. But the reality is their paths never crossed until they got to Moscow, of course, because they all fled to Moscow ultimately. And Blake and Philby became good friends until they fell out in a big way. And Blake and McLean became big friends in Moscow, but they didn't meet, and they weren't sort of co-spies or anything in the 50s. It's a very different kind of ideology. You know, it's a religious-based Islam. Blake's was a political ideology, even though it may have felt, communism felt like a religion, but it was a religion, you know, to all intents and purposes. I mean, I think in those days, it was a very black and white world, and you had the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc, and capitalism and communism, and he made his choice for communism, and those were the two big choices. It's a very different world now, but you know, you could argue that, you know, Islamic fundamentalism or jihad-ism, you know, has taken over from communism in some respects. Yeah, possibly. Yeah. He was given a sentence, 42 years, which undoubtedly he wouldn't have served the full length. He would have got a third off for, you know, good behaviour or whatever, but he would have served 28, 30 years, and he got out after 5 years. So, I mean, theoretically, the British state, the British criminal system is still after George Blake. I mean, he is, you know, he's a refugee from the law, from justice. So, if Blake got on a plane and arrived back at Heathrow, he would be arrested, and he would be taken away, and he'd be put back in jail. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I mean, just because the years' time has passed and he's no longer relevant and he's an old man. I mean, it's not the same situation, but if you remember the Nazi war criminals who were being rounded up at the age of 80 or 90, you know, they were pursued. I'm not saying Blake's not on the same scale, but I think he would be arrested. interested, yeah, if he came back, but he's got absolutely no intention of doing so. It's fantastic to come and do a signing at a shop, Harrison Harris in Clare, which you know, is embedded in the community. And I think independent bookshops do have a future, despite what people might say, if they're part of the community, if they're part of a shopping centre, a shopping complex as good as this. But they've got to stand on their own 2 feet as well. And they're there because they can talk to customers, they can give advice to customers, they can steer customers in the direction of good books, they can give people a love of good books. So it's great to be able to do it here. I'd far rather do it here than some big impersonal bookshop